Well, look, one issue has emerged in this vaccination debate which has not received the attention it deserves. I raised this a fortnight ago when I said there was a major problem for government with vaccination which could prove a minefield for business. I made the point a couple of weeks ago that, quote, this is what I said, business has a duty of care to all employees, an obligation not to expose their employees to potential potential difficulty in the workplace. And I went on that, quote, unfortunately, through all this coronavirus stuff, governments have been guilty, I said, of conflicting signals. Now, remember I told you there was a news poll which said that 75% of voters have said they'll probably be vaccinated. I said I was happy to accept the vaccine, but I know that others may not be. Now, it's not a question of anti-vaxxers, but rather of choice. And I raised the issue that employers were in an invidious position, re workplace health and safety, anti-discrimination laws, and a raft of legal issues. After all, employers can do no more than encourage employees to be vaccinated, unless the government releases a public health order making vaccines compulsory, which would be an extraordinary choice for a Liberal government meant to defend freedom of choice. So does one's employment finish up in the courts over emotional disputes as to whether vaccinated workers should work with unvaccinated workers? I asked a fortnight ago whether this, like hotel quarantining, would be passed off to the states. Thankfully, the issue has been raised by Ticky Fullerton, who is now the editor-at-large at the Australian Business Review. But I have to say, few people have addressed this critical industrial relations concern. Ticky Fullerton wrote recently and accurately, and I quote, businesses large and small will be blundering through a minefield of liability if the chief health officers in the states and territories don't order clear and consistent rules around COVID vaccination in the workplace. Ticky also said, and I quote, even then, employers will have to tread very carefully. And she cites the Australian Industry Group chief, Innes Willox, who's had extensive experience in government and business, as saying this is going to be the workplace relations issue of the year without a doubt. Let's go to Ticky Fullerton on this issue. Ticky, thank you for your time. I mean, Safe Work Australia have released work health and safety guidelines on employer obligations, but there's little comfort in any of this, isn't there?
There's very little comfort, Alan, and it is an absolute mess. You're completely right, both for big business and for all those small businesses that keep the economy going. Safe Work Australia has sort of set out a few scenarios and guidelines, but they just reveal what a extraordinary liability that businesses actually are having to bear. I mean, for example, if you are employing a workforce and somebody gets COVID-19 at work, you can be forced to pay workers' compensation. Now, if somebody gets the flu at work, you don't have to pay compensation, but partly because of the great traceability and the ability to actually pinpoint where this COVID outbreak happened, this is now part of keeping a workplace health and safety healthy. Now, if you take the other view and say, well, look, if that's the case and we have got that liability, then we actually must get all employees vaccinated. Well, then you're up for discrimination if you make that mandatory. And equally, if customers come your way, you could be, if you ask them to make sure that they've proved that they have had a vaccination, then again, that's discriminatory, potentially an invasion of privacy. So all this, as you say, is probably going to be tested in the courts.
Absolutely.
At the expense of business.
But, Ticky, the guidelines are contradictory. The guidelines say employers will be able to require customers and visitors to prove they've been vaccinated as a condition of entry to their premises. But then they say that employees will generally not be able to refuse to come to work because a colleague has not been vaccinated. I mean, this is the minefield we're talking about.
Well, that's right. And that's why, for example, Jennifer Westcott, it's really interesting here, Alan, because on some things, for example, the unions and business generally agree. Like, both sides actually believe that as many people as possible should be vaccinated. They support it. They also believe that you can't force, in general, mandatory vaccinations like the government, as you say, freedom of choice. But the way Jennifer Westcott at the Business Council and Innes Willox at the AIG differ is is Jennifer says, look, you cannot push all this liability onto business and the courts. It's really those chief medical officers in the states that had to step forward and provide some clarity. And, by the way, they all have to agree. And we know how hard that is.
That's the point, Ticky. That is the point. Different states might have different rules. I mean, you can't be requiring visitors or customers to bring proof of vaccination. You get rise to privacy and discrimination issues. And it's further complicated by the fact that the federal government has made vaccination voluntary, but then employers, you mentioned Inos Willox, he says employers have to provide a safe and healthy workplace. So there are people out there who are vaccine wary, and then there are the anti-vaxxers. So it comes back to the reasonable test. Is it reasonable to demand of an employee that they get vaccinated? Who will determine that?
We don't know the answer to that question, and that has to be tested either at the Fair Work Commission or in court. Now, there are some cases where you'd think, obviously, there's got to be some... I mean, after all, flu vaccines are mandatory in aged care and in hospitals. Well, they're not with COVID, really interestingly. And Qantas, for example, feels that they need to require their international flight team, when we do get up and fly to other countries, they all need to have vaccinations. Well, this is again where the union does actually slightly differ with Qantas, and they're saying, no, we can't have mandatory vaccines for Qantas. We disagree with that. Everybody should have a right to choose. And actually, they surely will be able to find a way to find work elsewhere. Surely we don't have to have this mandatory thing. But it is worrying that I think that the chief medical officers are hiding behind the state leaders, and the state leaders are hiding behind the chief medical officers, aren't they?
Surely the federal government is going to have to get its head around this. I mean, the rules have to be consistent, so business can make a call and finish up before the Fair Work Commission or the Fair Work Ombudsman. This is ridiculous. I saw that the CFMEU National Secretary Dave Noonan says the union will be guided by relevant health authorities, but then he says, at the sharp edge of it, is the union going to come out and say that everybody in every state has to be vaccinated, or we'll shut down the joint? No. Yes. I mean, Canberra are going to have to decide here, Ticky. This is a minefield.
Well, that's right. And even Jennifer Westacott would say, look, at the end of the day, the most important thing is to get this rollout happening and as fast as we can to as many people as we can. And if we have to sort of make it up as we go along, so be it. The most important thing is to get this rollout out. But it will be a sadness, I think, if we don't get more specific guidance from our chief health officers, who everyone is looking to for leadership.
Well, just finally, Ticky, I mean, what concerns me is, in all this vaccination debate, I've spoken about it, you've spoken about it, I can't read anywhere else we'll hear anyone making any comment about it, and no one in government.
Well, look, there's a few other things going on, I suppose, Alan, but I mean, I tend to agree with you. And once this rollout starts really happening, and we are getting people in a situation in small businesses where some people are vaccinated, some people are not vaccinated, some people are not happy about other people's views, and you do start getting the rubber hitting the road on this, I think you'll see a lot more coverage on it. Good
on you, Ticky. We'll keep in touch. You do a wonderful job, by the way. Brilliantly articulate, and you're right on top of the issues. Lovely to talk to you. There she is, Ticky Fullerton, and thank you for sharing your time. I mean, how big a problem is this? Email me. I'd like to hear your views. Alan@skynews.com.au or the text line 0414 000 848.